Hi, I'm Josh Rushing, filling in for Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, the United Nations is calling for, they're sounding the alarm for civilians in Syria as we ask, is the world indifferent to Idlib? Join the conversation, tweet us your thoughts at AJ Stream, or leave a comment in our live YouTube chat, and you too can be in the stream. The United Nations warns that the world is facing the worst humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century as the forces of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad close in on the last opposition stronghold, Idlib. That announcement by the UN comes as opposition forces backed by the Turkish military regained the key town of Syria on Thursday, as Al Jazeera's Hashim al-Helbara reports it's the first significant reverse for the Syrian army.
This is Jaber Ali Basha on the streets of Saraqib. For the rebel commander, this is just the beginning of a long push to recapture lost territory.
Saraqib is back under our control. We have managed to evict Syrian army, Russian ally and pro-government militias from Saraqib. I want to reassure our people that we will liberate all the cities of Syria and defeat the dictator.
But for the rebels to hold ground may be challenging. The city is located on two highways, M4 and M5, which link Damascus to Aleppo and northeastern Syria. Syrian government troops and Russian fighter jets are striking rebel positions, preventing them from reinforcing their lines of defense. A rare moment of triumph for the rebels. This is their first significant military gain in months. The opposition has lost many strongholds and retreated north, allowing the Syrian army to advance towards Idlib city. And as government troops close in, thousands of civilians flee. The offensive has displaced almost 1 million people and created the worst humanitarian situation since the start of the conflict in Syria 9 years ago.
The Syrian civil war has been called the worst man-made disaster since World War II. Save Idlib and Idlib under fire. These are some of the hashtags that Syrians are rallying around after the government's military campaign to take the opposition's last stronghold. The attack on Idlib has prompted the largest exodus of the war. Nearly 1 million people have fled the city, but are trapped at the Turkish border, which remains closed to refugees. A member of our community, Len Malouf, tweets, "Situation in Idlib is fast becoming one of the worst chapters yet of the Syrian war." Meanwhile, humanitarian organizations are calling on all parties to respect the rules of war. But critics are worried about what happens if the offensive doesn't stop. On Twitter, Razan Safour echoes what a lot of people are saying. Desperate intervention is needed. Here's what another member of our online community has to say about the children of Idlib.
Children are really terrified. 500,000 are on the roads looking for safety, but there's nowhere really safe. 10 schools were actually hit in one single day. And it's very important for Save the Children and its partners to be able to reach these families and children to provide the needed support. All sides really must respect the international humanitarian law, so schools and hospitals must really be off limits. Vitally, we need to see cessation of hostility, because this is the only chance children of Idlib will have a better future.
Joining us to discuss this in Hatay, Turkey, is Hashim al-Helbara. He's a senior correspondent for Al Jazeera English. In London, Jasmine El-Gamal, she's a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council and a former Syria advisor with the U.S. Department of Defense. In Amman, Jordan, Mays Nawaiza is an advisor with World Vision's Syria Crisis Response. And in Chicago, Illinois, Dr. Zahir Salul, he's the president of Med Global and has volunteered for multiple medical missions to Syria. Welcome, everyone. Hashim, I want to begin with you. Al Jazeera English is currently reporting that there is a counter-offensive coming from the Syrian government forces in Syria. Can you update us on what's happening there?
Well, basically, Josh, what is happening as we speak is that the Syrian army backed by Russia are trying both to
undermine the gains made by the rebels, particularly in Saraqib, and they're pounding their defense lines. They don't want the rebels to set up their defense lines in the city, and they don't want them to hold ground and get entrenched in the city. This is quite a strategic moment, a crucial moment for all the parties, particularly for the opposition. By taking over Saraqib, which sits on the intersection of both highways M4 and M5, they will cut off supplies for the military, for the Syrian army. The Syrian army won't be able to send troops, fighters, convoys, aid, logistics from Damascus all the way to the area or to Aleppo because of the new gains by the opposition. And both parties are willing to hold ground and continue making further gains in the near future. The rebels told us that they are determined to move south and take over another crucial area called Ma'arat al-Nu'man. So we're talking about intensified fighting, airstrikes, shelling by government troops and Russians, but at the same time, a determined push by the rebels to reverse gains made by the government over the last few months.
Hashim, considering the Russians own the airspace, is there much hope for the rebels being able to hold that ground?
Zero chances in the near future unless Turkey steps up its offensive, sends more fighters more soldiers into the area. Now, there are talks, crucial talks underway between Turkey and Russia, and Turkey has been insisting it wants Russia to give it access to the airspace in northwestern Syria, particularly over the skies of Idlib. If that happens, the Turks are hoping to be able to prevent the Syrian army from pounding or using fighter jets to strike rebels' position. One of the biggest concerns also here is that the government has been intentionally, according to all estimates, particularly by the United Nations, targeting civilian areas, paving the way for this unprecedented wave of displacement of civilians in Syria since 2011.
All right, so looking for what the Turks are going to do, President Erdogan just recently had these comments about Syria.
In Idlib, the developments on the ground are in our favor. But on the other hand, the regime's losses are very big. 3 of our soldiers have been killed. Let them rest in peace. But there is no time to deal with this now. Negotiations with the Russians will continue. However, we are operating in Idlib with the Adana Agreement, along with the 911-kilometer border. We are safeguarding our country. We will continue to operate in Syria, backing Syrian rebels until we win the war.
So, Jasmine, all eyes are on the Turks in this to see what they're going to do. I believe he gave a deadline to the Russians and the Syrians to the end of February, which is about 48 hours from now. Can the Turks stop the advancement from the Syrian government forces and the Russians if Erdogan decides he wants to?
It's hard to say at this point, honestly, because the Turks are in a bit of a tough position. Erdogan is under incredible pressure domestically to prove that he can and will stand up to the Syrians and stand up to the Russians in Idlib. Turkey's objective in Idlib has always been clear, which is to prevent a mass exodus of refugees, more refugees going into Turkey from Syria. And for that reason, he's been incredibly stringent in his public comments and in his actions on the ground to try to stop that from happening. Now, you're right. He said that as the deadline approaches, if the Assad regime does not stop its offensive in Idlib, the Turks will take actions. It's hard to see what kind of action that looks like, though, given that the Turks also are playing a very delicate balancing act with the Russians here. The Turks have certainly no desire to go head-to-head with the Russians in any sort of manner that would provoke a larger confrontation between the Turks and the Russians. But at the same time, they have to show that they're willing and able, at least willing, to do something to stop the Syrian offensive. So it's fairly obvious that Turkey will try to stop the offensive. They will probably, do more of what they've been doing so far, going into Syria and showing and proving to their domestic audience that they're going to do something about it. Whether or not they'll succeed, though, and how far they're willing to go is unclear.
Well, Jasmine, what does a Turkish escalation mean in terms of its NATO allies? Turkey is a full member of NATO, right? If they get involved, does NATO have their backs?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's one of the biggest frustrations that President Erdogan has voiced over the last few months, is how he feels that he's being abandoned by NATO. Turkey is a member of NATO, and they see themselves as having borne the brunt of the Syria conflict, really, when it comes to refugees, when it comes to the instability on the border. He's constantly asking the Europeans to give him more money to help him set up a safe zone so that he could send some of the 3 million refugees in Turkey back across the border, and he constantly is complaining that he's not getting enough support from NATO. So you'll remember that very recently, Secretary Pompeo and President Trump both stated, it was right after Turkish soldiers were killed by Syrian armed forces in Syria. Both President Trump and Secretary Pompeo came out and stated very clearly and very publicly that they stand with Turkey as a NATO ally. It was a big boost symbolically for the Turks, but again, what it means on the ground in real life, if something were to happen to the Turks, would the international community, would NATO members step in? It's again unclear, and I hate to keep using the word unclear, but it's just really, there's a lot of tension between what these actors are saying publicly and what they're willing to do when push comes to shove, especially NATO members who have said time and time again that they don't want to get involved in yet another conflict in the Middle East. So a lot remains to be seen.
Well, you brought up Pompeo there. It seems to me that the U.S. is not really a player in this at this moment, and NATO is trying to not be a player in this. It's this kind of new era in international affairs of, I've heard it called Westlessness, as in like the West doesn't seem to have much influence. Is that what we're seeing here?
Absolutely. And, you know, I think it's tragic what we're seeing. And you know, it's all well and good to come up with a catchphrase for it. But what it means for people on the ground is really, it's really heartbreaking to see what this sort of abdication of any sort of responsibility on the part of the West has meant for people on the ground in Syria. And I know that some of my co-panelists are going to speak about what they've seen on the ground. The bottom line is you have a U.S. president, a French president, you know, mostly Western leaders who are dealing with domestic audiences who are tired of Western intervention in the Middle East, who just, you know, look at the situation in Idlib just as one example of a situation of pure hopelessness. And they're kind of saying, well, what can we do about it? We don't want to get involved. This is kind of hopeless, sad, but hopeless. And so you're really seeing a very shameful abdication on the part of the West when it comes to Idlib. But I can tell you, as someone who worked at the Department of Defense, the way that the U.S. Department of Defense is looking at this, the way that the U.S. government is looking at this, and the U.S. National Security Advisor actually articulated this a few days ago. It's this idea, it's this kind of like big question of, well, what can we do? You know, what is it that we actually can do to stop this from happening? A lot of people have criticized, for example, Democratic presidential candidates for saying there's no military solution to the crisis and so on. But this is actually how the U.S. sees the conflict. I don't believe that whether it's Democratic candidates or the current U.S. president, if they're lying, that they're lying when they say that. They genuinely don't see what they can do to stop this. They see further escalation if they start bombing, for example, Assad's helicopters. They see potential escalation with Russia. If they support Turkey, they see the same thing. They see themselves getting mired into another conflict, and they see themselves actually being helpless to stop this. Now, whether or not we agree with that is one issue, but that's just how they see it.
I want to get to what's at stake here, and you alluded to it there in the middle of your answer, and it's those millions of people that are trapped between these militaries. I want to go to someone who sent us, a member of our community, who sent in a video comment. He's an orthopedic surgeon in Idlib, and his name is Omar al-Kharaki. Dr. Omar al-Kharaki, let's roll this.
Unfortunately, Idlib is now witnessing horrific atrocities by the Assad regime, Russia in the air, and pro-Iranian militias on the ground. Everybody here is wondering why the international community is deaf, blind, and mute to the daily and endless atrocities by the Assad regime against civilians. There are no safe spaces here in Idlib. the life of 3.5 million civilians here are at stake.
Yeah, Mays, I want to go to you. What is daily life like on the ground right now in Idlib city and Idlib province?
It's tragic. It's the worst situation that we've seen in 9 years. As already mentioned, over 1 million has been displaced over 10 times. Imagine leaving everything over 10 times. Out of these 1 million, it's 600 children, and they have nothing, absolutely no access to any health services, to sanitation, or to any warm clothes as well. Our field teams, unfortunately, have reported children freezing to death. Yesterday, 10 children were reported died when the schools were attacked. Again, it's very sad, and it's the worst that we've seen over the 9 years of war. Again, it's the responsibility of the international community to step up for an immediate, long-lasting ceasefire. This is what we need now. And again, it's very challenging to access these populations, despite of all of the efforts by the international community within this small area. It's not enough. We need more support to that. And we need to voice the concerns of these children and their families because they feel desperate. They have nothing, basically, and they feel abandoned all the time. Their needs are growing, and they're only growing. Our field teams, they're trying, but they've been displaced themselves, and they've been trying to support as much as they can, at the same time to take care of their loved ones. But again, it's never enough, and it's tragic.
Mays, we just got to come to a full stop right there. We're talking 600,000 children. They're sleeping not even in tents, and they're freezing to death. I read about a school yesterday that as the kids were leaving was bombed with cluster bombs. I think that's probably what you were talking about when you said the 10 kids dead. I mean, the world has got to stop and notice that. Like, this isn't just your every other day war in Syria. Like, something is happening here that the world needs to sit up and recognize. I want to go to another video comment from one of our viewers. She's in a tent outside Idlib. Here, check this out.
We managed to hitch a ride to get here after hours of waiting and asking people on the road. Since my husband died 8 months ago, we've been forced to move. It's depressing to think that I'll give birth here. It would be better if I had my own tent.
Dr. Zalul, I'm sure her story is not unusual. I know that you've been there on a number of medical missions. And will you just tell us the story of the little girl you met in the drawings?
I was in Idlib last month, right after this large exodus, and we were talking about 900,000 people. Half of them are children who are displaced. 15% of them, according to the UN, have no shelter even. Every old building, every school I visited was converted to temporary shelters. You have 1,250 camps in the province of Idlib. Some of them have 50 tents, some of them have 500 tents. So in one of these camps, we went and spent the night. It was very cold. It was raining. We had to wear special boots for the mud. It was very muddy. And children were drawing actually out of the mud these beautiful pictures that represents their lives. Children, by the way, are very resilient. Syrian children, like any other children, are very resilient. They want to go to school. They want to laugh. They want to tell stories. I asked them, how many of you would like to be doctors in the future? And 2/3 of them raised their hands. Some of them wanted to be teachers. Some of them wanted to be architects. Even a couple of them wanted to be presidents. And I asked one of them, her name was Asma Shbib. She's 12 years old. She's from the village of Jubbin, north of Hama. She was displaced with her family 7 times until she ended up in that camp. And she was drawing that beautiful picture that you've seen. I asked her, what do you dream of? She said, I want to be a doctor, but every day I have to walk for 2 hours to the school, and it's very muddy. I wish that there is less cold and less mud so I can walk easier to the school. So this is how children think. You know, we may think that they're only going through suffering, but actually they are thinking of their future. And these children in Idlib, 1.5 million children out of the 3 million civilians, can be a source of healing and reconstruction and rebuilding of Syria and the whole region if we focus on them.
This is just absolutely unacceptable that hundreds of thousands of children are living like this in the winter. Jasmine, what is the international community, what's the responsibility here? As I see this, it seems like a failure of the nation states. It seems like a failure of the international community. Like everyone has failed these people. Why?
You know, I don't think any of us can answer that question because it's just so impossible to look at the situation right now and fathom how no one could be doing anything. It's a complete failure on the part of the international community. The U.S. is getting a lot of criticism, but the Europeans haven't done anything. Arab countries haven't done anything. I mean, literally no one is doing anything about this. What could they do? I mean, they could do what they've done before. The international community was rallied together under President Obama when he first said that the chemical weapons used by President Assad would be a red line. I was working at the Pentagon at the time, and I remember being tasked along with my colleagues at the Joint Staff to draw up plans for what a U.S. retaliation or response would look like. And the president at the time had sent Secretary Kerry around to different capitals in the world to solicit support from our international partners for retaliatory action. Everybody was ready to go. At the very last minute, both President Obama and the UK Prime Minister at the time decided to go and ask for a vote of confidence, essentially, in the UK Parliament and in the US Congress, and that action was stifled. But it just goes to show that they were ready to do something. They can do something if the international community acts together as one. That would put enough pressure on the Russians, potentially, as opposed to just one country trying to go alone. And I think it's absolutely shameful that they haven't done so.
Hey, Dr. Zalol, if you're jumping in.
Yes, I think the international community, when we talk about the international community, it's not an abstract. I think we need to focus on the people who need to be shamed in this crisis. And the most important person is the Secretary General of the United States, or Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, because he's not exerting his moral leadership on this crisis. He should be right now on the Turkish-Syrian border. He should be meeting with the people of Idlib and telling them that the United Nations is with them, providing humanitarian aid, protecting their human rights, and protecting the civilians. He's not doing that. He's been in other catastrophes like in Libya, in Bangladesh, in Mozambique, and Bahamas, but he's not paying attention to what's happening in Syria, and he needs to be put under pressure so he can exert his leadership. Also, of course, the Democratic candidates right now in the United States, in my country, only in the last debate, they mentioned Syria, and there were questions about Syria, and their answers were very superficial, which means that they do not understand the relationship between what's happening in Syria and what's happening in the United States. The Syrian crisis has led to the worst global refugee crisis. 1 out of 4 refugees in the world is from Syria. That led to anti-refugee sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment, the rise of hate group, the rise of populism, the Brexit, and the rise of terrorism. And that affected us in the United States. And we think sometimes, our politicians think that Syria is this distant land where people are killing each other, but actually what's happening in Syria is affecting us in the U.S. And every politician in the Democratic Party or President Trump should care about Syria, and we can do a lot. President Trump can exert influence on Putin, can apply more sanctions, can pressure him so he can stop the bombing of children in schools and stop bombing of the hospitals. 67 hospitals in the province of Idlib were bombed by the Syrian regime and the Russian, undermining the rule of war every day in Syria. And this is dangerous for all of us.
And I think
you're right,
it's a really important point, actually, that Dr. Zaghloul is making. The point is that, you know, there are certain military options that you can use to, for example, stop helicopters from dropping bombs on
Jasmine,
hospitals.
Hey, Jasmine, hold on a second, because I'm about to have to wrap this. I want us to continue this conversation on Twitter. Before I go, though, Mays, do you have any advice to individuals out there, not the UN or the government, what they can do to try to help?
We have a responsibility as a humanitarian to continue supporting these civilians, to continue providing them with whatever we can, as long as we can, because we're losing access by the minute. Again, I'm calling for their humanitarian spirit to keep going. And again, we're calling for the international community to step up and to start the peace negotiation process,
hey, Mays,
an inclusive process.
I've got to stop you because we're about to lose the airtime on the show here. Guys, continue this conversation on Twitter. It's too important not to. I'm going to tweet out our Idlib coverage right now. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next time.